So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. Today I'm going to talk about Singapore blue carbon and what's the influence of seagrass on mangrove forests. So let's start about what is blue carbon. Blue carbon is defined as the carbon stored within the marine ecosystem and coastal ecosystems. So in these ecosystems, tropical seagrasses and mangroves play an important role. But where is this carbon mainly accumulated? So we can see here that mangroves and seagrasses, they have some carbon within the biomass in the above and below ground, but most of the carbon is actually stored mainly in the soil or in the sediment. But why mangroves and seagrasses are so good for storing carbon? First of all, mangroves and seagrasses, but also algae, are very good at uptaking CO2 from the atmosphere and keeping this carbon within the biomass. But additionally, mangrove roots and seagrass leaf have certain morphological traits that help to capture sediment. And within the sediment, there is a lot of carbon that is stored within the ecosystem. However, when we think about the ecosystems, we have to think they are not closed systems. They are systems that are open, and they interchange matter and energy with each other. So, for instance, some of the matter that is produced by the seagrasses will set down, but some other will be exported to adjacent ecosystems, in this case mangrove. And when the tides comes in, some of this particulate matter will be exported to the mangrove and the other way around. So having this, we have the hypothesis that ecosystems that are connected, in this case adjacent to each other, they will accumulate more carbon within the sediment in comparison with ecosystems that are isolated from each other, in this case mangroves and seagrasses. So taking that in account, we have a project when we include two tropical places, Zanzibar and Singapore, and two subtropical places, Florida and Adelaide. And in those places, we will compare isolated and connected seagrasses. But today, I'm just going to talk about the preliminary results that we got in Singapore. So the main aims of the work will be evaluate the influence of seagrass on mangrove beds, regardless carbon dynamics, and the second main aim will be measure the carbon stocks in seagrass beds and mangrove forests in connected and isolated places. To do so, here in Singapore, we selected two isolated places. One is Sungai Buloh and Selatar Island, when we just find mangroves, and one connected place when we find adjacent mangroves and seagrasses to each other. We select this zone because they have more or less the same climate patterns during the whole year, and also they have similar tide regimes during the whole year. So the method that I used was basically set up 3 transects along, starting for the terrestrial part, going through the mangroves, and then finishing up in the seagrass point when there were seagrasses, or in the mudflat when there was not seagrasses. And in high tide, I took water and I filtered it. With the filtered water, I measured the dissolved organic carbon, and with the particulate matter that stayed in the filter, we measured the suspended particulate organic carbon. Additionally, we took some water and measure the suspended particulate matter, and we measure the isotopic sign. And we also set up sediment traps to capture bigger size particles, and we left it during 24 hours. With the suspended particulate matter and with the sediment capture in the sediment traps, we ran a MixSIAR model to see what was the main origin of the sediment. We use as a source mainly 5 primary producers: macroalgae, seagrass, mangrove, terrestrial plants, and oceanic particles. And the second main aim was measure the carbon stock within the ecosystem. So for mangroves, we just measure the diameter on the shed side. And for the seagrass, we just took cores and measured the biomass. Additionally, we took some sediment cores and measured the carbon content. So looking at the results, we can see like DOC was slightly higher, more or less a ratio of 1 to 5, between 1 to 5. And we didn't see any difference between mangrove points and seagrass point, or mangroves and mudflat points when we measure, which means like there was not actually gradient, except for this point in one of the connected places when the quantity of carbon was higher, was a little bit higher in the water. So here, these are the results for the MixSIAR model, when we can see the composition of the suspended particulate matter and the sediment catch in the sediment traps. Or in other words, these SPN are particles with smaller size than these ones. So for the small size ones, we can see like the biggest source is actually oceanic sources, followed by algae and mangrove sources. For the connected places, we can see like seagrasses are actually the lowest contributor for the SPM. It was a little bit surprising, like the terrestrial was kind of a little bit higher than expected, but this is because of the catchment area of these 2 points was considerable high. However, when we look at the results of the sediment traps or bigger size particles, we can see like the source is mainly mangrove. Oceanic don't play a big role like in the small particle size, and algae play also a big role as well as terrestrial. Seagrass play or has a bigger contribution in bigger sizes compared with smaller sizes. However, it's not the biggest one. What I wanted to point out here is, regardless, this distance can be up to 500 to 700 meters. You can still see that the suspended particulate matter composition has some percentage that belongs to the seagrass. I'm just going to present the result of seagrasses because I'm in a seagrass conference. And here we can, So here we can see like the diversity can play a role in the carbon store, which is kind of easy to think about, because in this zone, when it's mainly Halodule and Halophila species, we have a little bit less carbon compared with the points like where Cymodecia rotundata is more abundant. In general, when we look at the total carbon stored in the coastal ecosystems, we can see like there was not a significant difference between the 3 places for the above ground and below ground biomass of the mangroves. Unfortunately, I didn't have any other point to compare for seagrasses, but if you remember, the hypothesis was what we found was that the connected ecosystem has actually less carbon compared with one of the isolated mangroves. This can be due to this mangrove has a big terrestrial influence, or basically the grain size or the sediment characteristics will be different, but we are still analyzing and discussing the results. So as a discussion or analyzing the results, we can see that in the Singapore, in the ecosystems evaluated, mangroves are exporting carbon in 2 ways, but the dissolved organic carbon was actually higher than the suspended particulate carbon, which is very important when we think about carbon dynamics, because the dissolved organic carbon is a way of carbon that will be used very quickly by the bacteria and microorganisms, while the suspended particulate organic carbon will be settled down faster or retained with the ecosystem because of weight. Surprisingly, when we think about this ecosystem, we know there are algae, but we don't think them as a big producer if we compare like a big tree or seagrasses actually look bigger than they are, but actually they, according to these results, they play a big role in the suspended particulate matter, which is very important to take in account when we think in carbon dynamics. Even though the size of mangroves and seagrasses in Singapore are small compared with other places in Southeast Asia, they still store a lot of carbon, and they are very important in general for the carbon dynamics within the zone. So the conservation is very important. And as a conclusion, thinking about the title, what is the influence of seagrass beds on mangrove forests? Actually, I have to say that mangrove forest has more influence on seagrasses than the other way around. However, both are important for each other. However, in this case, mangroves are contributing more to seagrasses or exporting more matter. And something that is more perspective is like eutrophication can increase the biomass of algae and reduce the biomass of seagrasses. This can influence the carbon sources of the SPN and therefore the connectivity process within the ecosystem. So it's a point to think about as a perspective when we think in the total carbon dynamic ecosystem. Thank you very much for your attention. Any questions?
Thank you, Daniel. Sure, Indra?
Yes, we've just finished looking at the mangrove and the seagrass in the entire Gulf of Mexico, estuary by estuary, extent times the amount of stock, and find that their mangroves far outshadow the seagrass, not so much in extent because they're 650,000 hectares, and the seagrass are 1 million hectares. But the mangroves are 366 teragrams, and the seagrass are only 184, whereas the marshes in the whole place are 109. So the mangroves, due to their much more productivity in these semi-tropical, tropical places, can outstock the seagrasses. I'm just making that because you said that there's a mixture.
Okay, thank you.
Different places, we can expect different things.
Yeah, right. However, our that's totally right. That's why we are comparing different sites across the globe, trying to in each place try to find locations where they have similar weather conditions the whole year around. But yeah, finding the perfect places when everything is similar is somehow difficult. This is part of our biggest project, and we are taking in account this geographic difference, also the size of the mangrove and seagrass beds, and trying to compare this data.
Barry?
Just a question about this, the thorny issue, what people mean by stock. One of them is the depth of which the potential disturbance, which has got to be on a case-by-case basis. I mean, even if you put a concrete apron on a mangrove forest, you've locked it in. Or if you remove the canopy, it's removable. So, so when you did a course with 30 centimeters, is that stock sort of a reference just to 30 centimeters depth?
Yes.
Between each one, it's normalized for that one depth.
No, just until 30 centimeters.
I never considered, as I go through sediment cores, I'm constantly surprised that every time I go through a sediment core, I see an event. It only has to happen once every 100, 200 years. And that could be a storm which brings in sand, and then there's mangrove underneath that. So it's a very tricky concept when normalizing, when you consider it may not be just a baseline deposition component. So we're looking at this in theory, but in reality, on a case-by-case basis, the story could be very, very different.
Yeah, that was a point of discussion when we started the project, and that's why we decide only the 30 centimeters, because it's more or less the recent history that we are looking for.
So you get rid of that problem of...
right, kind of reading of the problem. However, if we want to be more strict, we actually have to look at the accretion rate for each place, but in 4 years of PhD, I cannot do all this, so yeah. We just look at that was our solution. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Sure.
So was the carbon declining over depth, or was it remaining constant?
Oh, it changed for even within the zone it changed. Yeah, I can't remember by heart, but yeah, sometimes was not significant difference, but was not the same. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I'll give it up again for Daniel. So.